Getting to Know the Bible with Father Claudio Doglio. The Gospel according to Luke. Who was Luke? Scriba mansuetudinis Christi. This is how Dante Alighieri described the evangelist Luke, scribe of the meekness of Christ. It is a concise and adequate formula. The evangelist Luke is in fact a skilled writer inserted in the culture of Hellenism, and he has crafted a beautiful, neat story, picking up material from the tradition that preceded him. And he understood a fundamental aspect of Jesus, meekness, says Dante Alighieri. We could speak of God's mercy. Luke is the evangelist of mercy. He narrates the human experience of Jesus as the culminating moment of the revelation of God's mercy. But who is Luke? At the beginning of these lectures dedicated to the third gospel, I will stop at the identikit of the author. The name does not appear in the narrative, but tradition presents him unanimously as Luke. We have some information about him from ancient ecclesiastical texts. His name appears in 3 passages of the Pauline correspondence in which it seems that this character, this person, was a collaborator of Paul, who defines him as the dear doctor. Luke had a good and affectionate relationship with the apostle, and we found out that he was a doctor. Little else is added by the New Testament documents. From the other ancient sources, we can also retrieve some additional information. He was originally from Antioch, the great capital of Syria, a cosmopolitan city, and he had probably become a Christian by encountering the first Christian preaching carried out by people who had been expelled from Jerusalem at the time of the persecution that exploded in the time of Stephen. Barnabas was also sent from Jerusalem to Antioch to organize the new community of non-Jewish Christians. Then Barnabas went in search of Paul. He took him to Antioch, and together they formed a large number of people. It was precisely in Antioch that the term Christian was born to identify the new community. Among these new Christians in Antioch, there was also a physician named Luke. From the information we have from the ancient ecclesiastical tradition, we know that he died aged 84, long after Paul's death. And so we can imagine that in the 40s When he became a Christian, meeting Barnabas and Paul, Luke was in his 40s, early 40s, a middle-aged man with a beautiful profession. If he was a physician, he had a respectable social position. And considering the old standard, the fact that he could have studied as a physician tells us that he belonged to a wealthy family with good financial resources, which is why Luke had studied medicine as a young man, and of course, he had a good classical Greek literary culture. Greek was spoken in Antioch. It was one of the capitals of the Hellenistic world. Probably among his many studies, this physician could also have seen the translation of the Bible into Greek, the Bible that we call of the 70. It is possible that this man also read some passages from the Hebrew scriptures. And maybe he was a man in search, interested in various cultures, taking into account that Antioch was a city in which people converged from all the old Eastern surroundings. He was used to meeting people of different cultures, languages, of different religions. And among these people, he also met some disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. And it was the decisive encounter of his life, an encounter that marked the physician Luke for the rest of his days. He was fascinated, admired by the character of Jesus, wanted to meet him, got baptized, became a Christian. He befriended Paul. He strongly bonded with him and accompanied him many times. He wrote not only the Gospel, but also the Acts of the Apostles. And it is precisely in the Acts of the Apostles where we can obtain some important information about the presence of Luke following Paul. In fact, in Acts, there are some passages written in the first person plural. And it is a way in which the writer lets it be understood with fine modesty. I was there too, without saying it. For example, in chapter 16, arriving in Troas, Paul and his collaborators stopped there for a few days. Then the narration continues, changing person. We left Troas. We sailed towards Samothrace. We got to Neapolis. Then we got to Philippi. The first person plural reveals that the writer was there and therefore accompanied Paul on a sea voyage from Troas to Philippi. When Paul leaves Philippi, the story resumes in the third person plural. We reconstruct that Luke, in that occasion, stopped at Philippi. Most likely, it was his adopted city. Native of Antioch, he arrived together with Paul to the great city of Philippi, a Greco-Roman city in Macedonia, northern Greece, and remained there. He remained as the head of the Christian community that had been formed in this new urban reality. And he remained as a formator, animator of the community, until years later, Paul, returning from a trip, stopped in Philippi, and from that moment, Luke joined Paul and accompanied him during the last trips without leaving him. Probably as a medical expert, he had noticed that the apostle had serious health problems and was therefore close to him as an assistant, as a physician friend, capable of curing him. Together they went to Jerusalem, where they arrived for Pentecost of the year 58. On that occasion, Paul was arrested and imprisoned for 2 years, awaiting trial. In those 2 years, Luke was lucky to stay in and around Jerusalem. It was a journey through the Holy Land that lasted a long time and offered him an exceptional opportunity to know the places, but above all, to know the people, meet eyewitnesses, the relatives of Jesus, those apostles who were still present in Jerusalem, meeting many other people who had seen Jesus some 30 years before. There seems like many years, but for a middle-aged person, there are few years, and one has an excellent memory of things that happened 30 years before. If, on the other hand, these are important and significant facts that have affected the person and the imagination, then the memory remains very fresh. Luke, in those 2 years, had the opportunity to travel from Jerusalem to Caesarea, meeting many people, collecting documents, and finding written material, participating in liturgies of the Christian Jewish community. He did not know Hebrew or Aramaic, but the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem knew Greek because it was the lingua franca that everyone used. And therefore, Luke had the opportunity to visit the places where the ministry of Jesus took place. He went to Jerusalem. He went to Bethlehem, probably visited Nazareth. He got an idea of reality and learned many things from eyewitnesses. He stayed those 2 years to be close to Paul while he was being held in prison in Caesarea Maritima. When the governor changed, it seemed that the process would be resolved favorably, but Paul appealed to Caesar, and then the prisoner was sent to Rome by sea, of course, naturally. Luke embarked with Paul and went to the capital of the empire. They were shipwrecked near Malta. They were saved. They spent the winter there, and in the following spring they continued their journey, arriving in Rome. Paul remained awaiting trial for another 2 years in house arrest, and his assistant Luke was lucky this time to be in Rome with Paul. While Paul was in prison and had to remain under house arrest in military custody under a soldier on guard, Luke was free and could move and get to know the community of Rome. At that time, in the early 60s, there was Peter in Rome. There was Barnabas. Silas had arrived there. Also Timothy as well as Paul. And Luke meets also Mark, who in those years was collecting materials for his gospel. At the beginning of the 60s, inside the Roman community, Mark has the task of putting together documents that were already circulating about the preaching of Jesus. And Luke adds this new knowledge to his experience. And after 2 years awaiting trial, it all ended in a soap bubble. The accusers did not appear. Paul was released because the fact had no evidence, and Luke resumed his travels with Paul for a few more years, from 63 to 67, when they returned to Rome. And on that occasion, the apostle was arrested again, and this time sentenced to death. Under Nero, Paul was beheaded on the Via Ostiense and buried there. Then Luke, not having to follow the Apostle Paul, he retired to private life. But he did not shut himself up in his private world. Retired to a city in Greece, not well identified, where he certainly became the guide of a Christian community. There he spent the last years of his life. When the Apostle Paul died, Luke was about 60 years old. He was his contemporary, perhaps a little older. Only he lived another 20 years. And then, throughout the 70s and 80s, he had a chance of collecting ideas, memories, and literary material that during all that very important apostolic experience from countless trips with Paul, he had gathered. How does Luke compose his gospel? He tells it at the beginning of the text. It is the only case in which an evangelist introduces a method prologue. It is a typical of Hellenistic writers. Luke actually has an Hellenistic writing culture and begins his work with a complex phrase that occupies the first 4 verses, in which he summarizes the different stages of his work. Let us read this text because it helps us to frame his literary method well. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down and in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. With these words, the evangelist Luke presents us with a series of stages that, from the historical event of Jesus, led to the writing of this book. The first volume of his work, in 2 volumes, because the second part is the Acts of the Apostles. First of all, there are the events that have occurred among us that concern Jesus of Nazareth. Not ideas, not myths, but concrete historical facts, dated and placed in time. An important fact that had eyewitnesses. And Luke uses the same term which Greek historians like and speaks of autoptai, those who see with their own eyes. We use the term autopsy, which means to have to do only with corpse, but it's a technical term to indicate verification in person of a fact. There are eyewitnesses who from the beginning became ministers of the word, servants of the Logos. These are the apostles. They knew Jesus. They lived with him. They knew him well. They became servants of their preaching. They have told others what they have seen and heard. The preaching of the apostles, therefore, it is the first important step after the historical events of the world. Jesus reveals himself as the Messiah, Son of God. Eyewitnesses find it, experience it, and then they talk to others about what they have seen and heard. Their experience is not only transmitted verbally, rather it requires a written form. Luke says that many have tried to tell the facts in order. I don't think that it refers only to Mark, who had already written, and to Matthew, that maybe he hadn't even written yet and was in a different environment from where Luke lived. The evangelist refers to many. Therefore, it means that in the first years, in the first decades after the Passover of Christ, many short texts had to circulate that collected some information. Texts of the words spoken by Jesus, accounts of events related to his life, especially the culminating episodes of his passion, death, and resurrection. During his travels, Luke many eyewitnesses and probably collected many of these documents. So he decided to make a literary work himself with precise research. Also, in this case, he adopts a technical term from the Greek language, akribos, which has also entered our English vocabulary, although it is not used in a literary context. Akribia, exact, sure, scrupulous, refers to a rigorous accuracy, to exactitude or the precision in the cultural sphere. Luke, as an accurate and documented historian, says that he has collected oral testimonies and written documentation and that he personally reworked them. It is an important wording made by Luke. That is, he has written, cut, and amalgamated, corrected, adjusted all the material he received to compose a literary text that fit his intentions. This work is dedicated to the illustrious Theophilus, a character about whom we know nothing. The adjective illustrious, kratiste in Greek, was used by high officials of the Greco-Roman administration. So, this would suggest a real person present in the city where Luke lived, to whom the work was actually dedicated, probably the sponsor of an authorized person who could support the publication of the work and make it available to the public. And some have also wanted to see simply a symbolic name. Theophilus means friend of God. And beyond the concrete historical fact of the dedication, this book is addressed to you. If you are a friend of God, if you are interested in knowing the story of Christ, then this work was written for you. And it is written so that you can realize about the solidity of the teachings you have received. This Theophilus is not a beginner. He has been already catechized. He's already a Christian. He has received the teaching. Luke's work serves to demonstrate that the Christian message is founded. The doctrine preached by the apostles of Jesus is not a far-fetched, it is historical and literary strength. Luke, in turn, became a minister of the word, and he offered us a splendid text, the third gospel, that we want to read as a reliable documentation of this important event. God's mercy has been made known to us. We can appreciate how good this scribe of the meekness of Christ was.